Okay, here we go. We're going to go to chapter 7. Chapter 6, it just ended off. Lars was at Aunt Cass's memorial. So, chapter 7, pasty treats and hasty retreats. I ended up that long, sad day sprawled on my bed trying to decipher the dotted lines and colored squares on my history book's map of the Battle of Brandywine. Chad's Ford, Jeffrey's Ford, Jones's Ford, Brenton's Ford. I read to myself, feeling very confused. Sounds like a bunch of car dealers. I snapped the book shut and lobbed it to the other end of my bed. As I looked up, my eye was caught by the portrait of my ancestor. I went over for a closer look. You must have been around during the Revolution, I said aloud. Wish you could fill me in on Brandywine and what happened with all those darn Fords. I turned to the Pennsylvania map Mom had put on my wall and examined it closely, hoping to find a clue. Chad's Ford was there, a little town next to Brandywine Creek, but the black line of Route 1, the highway crossing the creek nearby, didn't show a ford or ferry or anything other than a plain old bridge. I threw myself down on the window seat. My rear came down hard on something knobby. Ouch! I said loudly, discovering a metal hinge. Curving my fingers around the edge of the seat, I gave a hard pull. The top flew up, slamming into my nose, which started to bleed. Pinching my nostrils with one hand, I stuck my other inside the hollow base and felt a box. A box big enough to hold a will. My heart thumping, I lifted out the box and gingerly opened it. There was nothing inside but a black leather flower. Disappointment made me throw it down and growl. Looks like I got a bloody nose for nothing. Nothing, Lars? That's a cockade of my brother Will. It was Geordie, lounging on my bed, buckled shoes and all. He wore it on his hat. The colors showed he sided with Washington. Why, that cockade was Will's only uniform for a good long while. Wait a minute, I protested. What about his blue and tan uniform like George Washington's? I found my history book and opened it to a picture of Washington. Geordie sprang up from the bed. Your ignorance is vastly amusing, Lars. Early in the war, hardly anybody had a real uniform, except for rich people like Washington. And those uniforms were all different colors, not just blue and buff. Some American uniforms were as red as the ones the British soldiers wore. He looked at the history book picture and chuckled. Nay, country boys like Will were lucky if they had a whole pair of ordinary breeches, let alone a whole uniform. Sometimes they'd make themselves leather hunting shirts to use for a sort of uniform. In truth, Washington liked to have them wear those shirts because the British figured everybody in one was a genuine sharpshooter. Most of those American boys couldn't hit the broadside of a barn, but they surely did look the part. Will was proud of this cockade, Geordie went on, stooping over to pick it up. Many didn't even have these. Why, even the army marched through Philadelphia. When the army marched through Philadelphia, General Washington ordered all the men to put green leaves in their hats, so there'd be at least one thing uniform about the troops. It was just before the battle at Brandywine Creek. Brandywine? I crowed. Great. I was just wishing old George there could talk and help me with this. I waved the Brandywine study sheet at him. Guess I've been studying too hard. I'm talking to pictures as well as ghosts. That is, shades. Indeed, Geordie remarked dryly. I'll tell you about that terrible day, but only if you stay mum. Badger me with questions and I'll not go on. 'Tis a bargain? 'Tis, I echoed, barely knowing what I bargained for. All right, so notice now we've got a different font. It's italicized. So this is Geordie talking about what happened, Brandywine. That fall of 1777, after Will left home, was probably no stormier than any other, but I remember it as a blustery, tempestuous time. Doubtless my memory is clouded by my father's fury and my mother's despair over Will's joining the Patriot forces. As time passed, father's anger settled down into a sadness that changed him. Before, there had been songs and playful tricks to lighten the tedium of fruit picking. But that fall there was no Will taking away my ladder to strand me on a limb, and no Will's whistle summoning me to cool off in the pond when Father was not about. No, that fall there were but 3 of us filling our shoulder-hung buckets, our hearts aching as much as our arms. One September evening, his mother was making apple butter, and I was stringing fruit for drying. Father came storming into the kitchen. "Another folly of those rebel hotheads!" he exclaimed bitterly. "And this one's likely to ruin us." Quietly, Mother put down her paddle and swung the kettle out away from the coals. Then she moved across to Father. "Seat thyself, Laban, and try for a bit of composure," she said softly. "Composure? And what composure do they show those madmen calling themselves the Continental Congress? Congress of traitors, I say. Madmen and traitors." I swallowed. "What did the Continental Congress do, Father?" "That so-called Congress has officially decreed that apples can no longer be exported to England. Our half-picked crop, now worthless. We might as well feed it all to the pigs." "Nay, Laban, don't take on so. Surely Geordie can sell the apples in Philadelphia or peddle them to the country inns." Mother passed her hand over his dark hair affectionately. Father's expression softened. He looked at me and smiled. "Poor Geordie. Seems only yesterday you were playing with gewgaws. Remember the toy soldier from England that I bought in Philadelphia when you were still in leading strings?" I nodded. Next to the cup and ball that Will had carved of applewood from our trees, that lead soldier had been my favorite toy. How Mother had protested when Father had given the small grenadier to me. With her Quaker beliefs, she didn't think it fit for child's play. I also remembered Father's present for Will that same day, the day our first apple shipment to England, arranged by Benjamin Franklin himself, had occasioned a special treat. Father had brought Will a signet ring, inscribed grandly in Latin, with our family joke about Will's stubbornness in name, ubi voluntas vi ibi ist. Where there's a will, there's a way. I wrenched myself back to the present and replied to my father's question. I remember the soldier well, and still keep it by me, Father. 'Tis my lucky piece. I tried to get Will to take it with him, but perhaps his ring will bring him the luck he needs. I crossed to the settle and took out another length of thread. When I turned back, the shuttered look had returned to my father's face. "What Will needs is a dose of reason. I forbid you to mention his name again," he said gruffly. Mother and I exchanged unhappy looks. Father began pacing back and forth. "You're right, Patience," he said after a time. "Geordie must peddle those apples, and he'd best start tomorrow. 'Tis rumored the British army is coming up from Chesapeake Bay to take Philadelphia back from the rebels. I, for one, will give General Howe a most warm welcome, and there are many who share my sentiments, although they've feared to speak out whilst the rebels are in the saddle hereabouts." He crossed the room and opened the cupboard hidden in the woodwork over the fireplace. Inside we kept our spices, money, and valuable papers, safe from mildew and robbers. Father brought out some farthings and closed the cupboard door. "Here's a bit of money for your journey, lad, but try to barter for your board and keep as you go. Gold coins are scarce." "But Laban, if the British army is coming, mightn't Geordie be in danger?" Mother protested, her eyes dark with worry. "Nonsense, Patience. The British are gentlemen, and Geordie is loyal to his king and country. They'll not harm him." So it was that early the next day I set off with a wagon load of apples, pears, cider, and perry to sell to the country taverns down Brandywine Creek way. By late afternoon, I'd sold everything but 4 kegs of perry. I found a buyer for 3 of these in Mr. Welsh, whose tavern stood 4 miles west of Chad's Ford, one of the several places where Brandywine Creek could be waded in safety. These fords, besides being shallow spots in the stream, offered the only clear access to the river bank, which elsewhere was steep and thickly wooded. As it was dark by the time I made my bargain with Mr. Welsh, I decided to stay the night. There were few guests, so I had the luxury of a bed to myself. I quickly readied for sleep, rubbing my teeth with a chalked rag and adjusting the bed ropes more tautly under the sagging mattress so that I might sleep tight. I slept far too tight. not waking until nearly 9. Fearing that Father would be angry at my dawdling, I hurried downstairs to settle up my accounts with a jovial tavern keeper. Mr. Welsh was busy in the common room with a lively group of customers. He told me they were a patrol of American mounted sentries called vedettes. The sight of these Continentals washing down slabs of ham with hot steaming toddy filled me with great dismay. Last I'd heard, the American army was miles away, close to Philadelphia, capital city of the rebellion, simply because the Congress of madmen and traitors met there, or had before fleeing to York. At any rate, the presence of Washington's forces at Welsh's tavern could mean trouble was close at hand. I sat down quietly on the puncheon bench and helped myself to the ham. I reckoned I should find out what was going on, else I might blunder into trouble on my way home. My attention was drawn by the thunderous sound of Mr. Welsh's huge hand slamming down on the rough wooden tabletop. "So, lads, you think I should run and hide like a rabbit because the British are on their way? Nay, I'm a neutral party. I shall pour punch for any thirsty man with nary a thought for his politics." One of the soldiers shook his head in disbelief. "But politics is nothing when a battle's in the offing, you fool. A cannonball doesn't stop to inquire if you've taken sides. The British camped last night at Kennett Square, only 2 miles west of here. They may arrive at any time, going east to Chad's Ford. But Washington's troops are waiting for them there." Mr. Welsh took a long swig from his own mug and set it down with a clatter. "If you're all so fired up, certain the lobsterbacks are coming through here, you'd best pay your shot and move along. I'd hate for you to be interrupted before settling up." "Won't be so soon as all that, old man," laughed another vedette. "Pour another round. This day promises to be long and hard, and I must needs fortify myself to face those redcoats." "I'll settle up with ye now, if you please, sir," I said timidly. Mr. Welsh's hearty laugh rang out. "Only one gentleman is wise enough to settle his accounts ahead of the lobsterbacks, and 'tis my misfortune to owe him, not the other way around." He slapped me on the back. 'Twas kindly meant, but I felt it to my ribs. "You go out and harness your team. When you return, I'll have your money ready for you and a nuncheon to take along." I thanked the tavern keeper, then ran outside and hitched up my father's slug-footed team, Daisy and Buttercup. A morning fog was rising, but I could clearly see the vedettes' horses nearby. When I returned to the common room, Mr. Welsh handed me a small leather pouch full of coins and a bundle that smelt of spicy apple tart and a savory beef pasty. It was then that we heard the first shouts and the sound of marching feet coming up the road from Kennett Square. Instantly the vedettes dropped to the floor. One crawled like a crawfish across the uneven wooden planks to peek through the shutters. Mr. Welsh and I stood, staring at each other. "Ready your muskets," hissed the soldier at the window. Mr. Welsh whispered so loud I thought the pewter tankards would shake on the boards. "Nay! Don't fire! There are too many. You'll rot in prison ships or in the grave unless you get out." "But we can't reach our horses." "Then use your bloody feet," Mr. Welsh growled. "Take the path at the back. Comes out down the road closer to Chad's." The men rushed from the room, petrified with fear. I watched Mr. Welsh stride across and throw open the front door. I could hear his voice booming forth. "Welcome to Welsh's Tavern, sir. May I offer you a hot toddy to ward off this dreary fog? Geordie, be a good lad, and fetch a mugful for this officer." My hands were shaking so that I could barely keep the toddy from sloshing over the edges of the cup, but somehow I managed to heat the drink with a red-hot poker and carry it outside without spilling too much. Out of the corner of my eye I glimpsed red-coated soldiers in endless columns, but fear kept my gaze to the ground as I approached the officer.